today is optimizing. This webinar is sponsored by the University of Wisconsin Division of Extension and UW Pest Management Program. I'm Kevin Jark. I'm the Crops and Soils Regional Educator for Outagamie and Winnebago counties, and I will be your host today. So we'll go to the next slide. While many of you are familiar with virtual presentations in the Zoom platform, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items. Please keep your microphones muted and videos off during the webinar. The mute and video controls are located on the button left-hand side of your screen. Also, please feel free to type questions for our presenters into the chat box at any time. The chat box is located on the bottom center of your screen. We will answer as many questions as we can as time allows. We're offering CCA credits for today's webinar. We will have a link for a form at the end of the presentations, and we'll have a QR code for you to scan and enter your name and certification number. We will submit all information by the end of the week to the American Society of Agronomy. If you have any questions or difficulties with the Zoom technology today, you can type your question into the chat or alternatively email Jerry Clark. His email is jerome.clark@wisc.edu. And so he can look for that. If you're having difficulties with your audio, the call-in information is also posted in the chat. So with that, what we're going to do is go ahead and move forward. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Joe Lauer, corn agronomist, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's going to be discussing best management practices for profitable corn silage production in 2023. Joe?
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, everybody. So we're into another season. This is kind of the start of the 2023 season, and there's a lot of things always happening this time of year. And one of the things that I always am concerned about is a lot of prognostications going on, a lot of worry about drought and getting things in and supplies and that sort of thing, and all rightly so. But always remember that really for a lot of what we do, what we really have to be thinking about is just kind of managing for the average, because there's really no, if I knew there was going to be a drought, I'd change my practices, but I never have been able to predict the drought yet. And so again, just keep that in mind to manage for the averages. What I was asked to do today was basically kind of go through some practices that I see changing in the world of corn silage, and I'm just going to concentrate on a few things. And I'm going to start with, all right, why didn't this thing go ahead? No, there we go. I'm going to start with our UW or hybrid selection, and basically what we see with in the case of corn silage is that if we have a 1 ton per acre increase for the Wisconsin corn dairy, corn grain and dairy producers, that'll increase farm income about $20 to $60 million. We grow corn on about 4 million acres, 1 million acres of which is corn silage, but just small changes in overall production mean big economic changes throughout the state. For example, corn grain, if you're looking at, we're typically seeing 2 bushels per acre per year, but even a 1 bushel per acre per year, you multiply that by 3 million acres, and $4 or $5 a bushel, that adds up really quickly. Last year we tested about 420 corn hybrids at 14 locations. One of the unique things about Wisconsin is that we go from about 110 or 115 day hybrid in the southwestern part of the state all the way up to an 85 and earlier day hybrid in the northern part of the state. And probably no other state really has this wide range of hybrid maturities. Minnesota runs typically about their longest season hybrids are typically about 100 to 105 day hybrids. And once you get south in Illinois and Indiana and Iowa, the maturities really don't range that much, typically about 100 to 115 day or so in the southern part. So because of that, we have a lot of hybrids tested in Wisconsin, and we've looked at a lot of bioengineered traits through the years. And this program is really based, it's really a way to look at unbiased performance of corn hybrids throughout the state. I kind of call it the consumer report of commercial corn hybrids and that are available in the state. Typically, in any 1 year, we're probably getting only about 1/3 of the hybrids sold in the state, but usually they're the ones that are going to be marketed and sold in the future. We're getting these kind of early oftentimes, and it's kind of the hybrids that will be available in the future. Having said that, again, this decision is oftentimes made by the agronomist or other people, but I want to really try to drive home the importance of the decision in terms of some of the economics that are involved here. If you take the top and bottom hybrid in a silage trial, typically, and we started this program in 1995, so we've got a lot of years of work with this. But if you take the top and bottom hybrid and just take the difference, we'll see an average of about 3.5 tons of dry matter per acre difference between that top and bottom hybrid. And this slide here kind of shows you the range that we see through the years. I mean, some years you'll have some trials that it's over 7 tons of dry matter per acre difference between the top and the bottom hybrid. And even if this was just half, that's still a fairly significant amount of difference that we'll typically see between hybrids. Of course, yield drives everything, but quality and overall milk per acre is important as well. Again, typically we'll see about 470 pounds of milk per ton difference among the hybrids that we've tested through the years. And when we get to milk per acre, the average is about 11,900 pounds of milk per acre difference. And again, if this is just half of the difference, just kind of looking at where the average might sit, that's still pretty significant in terms of the potential that can be realized with just good hybrid selection. So these numbers of 3.5 tons, 470 pounds per ton, 11,900 pounds per acre is what's part of this next slide that kind of gets at the range in the decision-making that goes on with the various decisions that need to be made. So for example, if you look at the top and bottom entry, you'll see 3.5 tons dry matter per acre difference. That's about a 40% yield swing typically. Milk per ton is 470. That's about a 14% yield swing. And then milk per acre is about 11,900 pounds of milk per acre difference. And that's again about a 40% yield swing. And as you go down through all these different decisions that are made as you wrestle with, what you're going to do growing corn silage the next year, you can kind of get a feel for where to really put your time in terms of some of these decisions. For example, hybrid type, BMR versus a leafy or just a regular dent corn. I mean, that's an 18% yield swing especially with the BMR types. And you're looking at with BMR, about typically 4,000 pounds per acre difference lower with the BMR type, but it is better quality. Usually it's about a 6% improvement in terms of quality. So again, there's a lot of different decisions that go into production. I'm going to spend a little more time on hybrid selection, but I also want to spend some time on plant population because of all the things that are kind of going on right now in terms of where corn production is going. Plant population is changing probably the most. And then another one that's coming in kind of more recently is in the whole area of some of the biologicals that are out there. So as far as selecting hybrids, we in Extension have always recommended using independent yield trial data and a multi-location average if you can get them, and then evaluating the consistency of performance for yield, mil per acre, and mil per ton. And this is what we've always kind of recommended, and yield probably drives this more than anything else as far as the decision that needs to be made. But in the bioengineered era that started in 1996, and we've lived through this now for, gee whiz, 27 seasons now, you know, there's also some other things that need to be taken into account. Every hybrid's got to stand on its own. And what I mean by that is hybrids are oftentimes bought and sold by families. So they'll switch out a BT corn borer trait and maybe add in Roundup, or they might combine Roundup and BT corn borer and corn rootworm traits, but they're all from the same family or the same genetics. Well, we've known from very early on that these different traits interact differently among the germplasm of the corn hybrids that are sold. And sometimes in the case of grain, we'll see a 35 bushel swing with one traded product of a family versus another traded product of the family. And again, very significant differences that go on with these interactions. And you have to be careful of that. And you really have to buy and purchase the one that you're going to get. Sometimes you'll buy just a BT corn borer hybrid, but get delivered a Smart Stack and you think you're getting a good deal. Well, that's not oftentimes the case because, again, especially in the case of Smart Stacks, there's a lot of interactions that can go on that can reduce the overall yield and quality of the corn silage of the hybrid that you're using. Pay attention to seed costs. This is generally what I've seen is when there's more than $75 a bag difference between one hybrid and another, you really have to question the use of growing that more expensive hybrid. Now, that's a big change for us in Extension. We always say you go with the best performing hybrid well, cost comes into account, but usually cost wasn't as much of a factor. But now some of these hybrids can cost quite a bit. And again, when you get more than $75 a bag, it becomes very difficult to justify the more expensive hybrid oftentimes. And then finally, buy the traits you need. Again, this is kind of difficult, but in northern Wisconsin, oftentimes we don't need the corn rootworm trait because we got a lot of crop rotation going on out there. And you know, again, sometimes you just don't need the traits. The bottom line, though, is that traits don't add to yield. What they do is protect yield. And I always bring up this exception of Drought Guard, because this is one where, especially in a drought season, where that could really be of importance. But one of the things I want to leave you with is that, you know, we've seen a lot of changes over the last generation of, you know, the last 26 years or so with these bioengineered traits. And visiting with people in the industry, we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. There are some tremendous biological engineered traits that are coming that are not necessarily transgenic. In other words, what we call cisgenic, where they're taking the genes of the corn plant themselves, upregulating them and seeing yield increases. These are things like increased photosynthetic rate, for example, and nitrate reduction, nitrogen reduction in the plant. All traits that really help with yield. And these are all coming down the road. And I think we're going to see a lot more of these as we go forward in time with hybrids. We generally try to teach the way to pick hybrids with this graph here. You've got high yield up in this corner quadrant here, high yield and quality up here, high quality in this lower right part of the quadrant. And then this is where you want to stay out of. There might be real reasons to be choosing hybrids from these other three quadrants, but staying out of here is what's important. Generally, the trial average sits right here for milk per acre and milk per ton. And this circle is the LSD. And you can kind of visually move this around to basically separate hybrids on the graph. We started last year highlighting hybrids that were significant for forage yield, milk per ton, and milk per acre. So these hybrids right in here are the best that were available statistically for all three of those traits. And again, what you want to be doing is picking hybrids up in this part of the quadrant of this graph. Realize, though, that there is a lot of difference between hybrids, especially with the BMR trait. Generally, what we see with BMR is that you have less lignin, higher stover digestibility, but it comes at a price. The BMR trait is a lethal gene that oftentimes reduces forage yield. It does increase quality in terms of milk per ton, but because you have lower yield, you tend to have a little bit lower milk per acre. So, but cows do respond to BMR hybrids, and they do very well with the BMR traits that are out there. And again, it's kind of there's trade-offs with growing this kind of a hybrid, but it's kind of the extreme. It's just the extreme in terms of quality that's available to a dairyman as you wrestle with the kind of hybrid that you're going to grow. So that's all I kind of wanted to say about the hybrid trials. I wanted to move on now into some of these management decisions that are involved. One of the things to remember with all of our plots, basically what we do is we run what's called a paired plot kind of a trial where we plant 8 rows and 4 rows are used for silage harvest, and then 4 rows are harvested later for grain. So we know exactly what was happening in terms of yield and quality for silage, as well as the overall grain yield later on in the season when we come back about a month later. And we're measuring everything on a rep basis, so we can statistically get at and have a little more power with our experiments a little bit. The one management thing I want to consider today, though, is this idea of plant population, and know that plant population is really changing among Wisconsin farmers. This is USDA data where we collect statistics, and the first measurement that's taken in August is a population measurement. And this is done at about 600 random fields throughout the state. And you can see the average population and how it's been changing over the last really 30, 40 years here. It's been going up at the rate of 270 plants per acre per year. And the point I want to make here is know that it's changing, and corn seems to be responding to higher populations in commercial fields. This is true not only for Wisconsin, but also for the I-states as well as Minnesota, where the plant population optimum, or the reported populations have been going up from 280 to 300 plants per acre per year. Because of this, there's a lot of questions going on about where the maximum yield occurs, where's the economic optimum that occurs. We know there's hybrid differences that go on. Or should silage fields be handled differently than grain fields, and all those kinds of things. But whenever you start to adjust populations, you do take on some risk, and there are some effects in drought years. Typically, you just don't see the yield response then, and what you are out on is the ROI on the seed costs that are there. But in good years, you can also have some lodging going on, as well as barrenness and that sort of thing. And then you got the whole precision farming types of things that can go on, and the options we got on our modern planters to be able to adjust plant population on the go. And that's been a difficult thing to get a handle on. What I wanted to do, though, is just kind of show what we see for grain yield as well as forage yield. And what I'm going to use is 10 years of data. We actually do this every year, so I need to update this slide, but the principle is the same here. We actually plant hybrids, usually over 50,000, but in some years and in some spots, we've actually gone up to 100,000 plants per acre with this. And this is what we see for grain. This is the response that we see for grain yield. And if you were to look at where that maximum yield occurs, it occurs a little over 40,000 plants per acre. Now remember, most growers are back down in here, a little over 30 to 32,000 plants per acre. I always figure, though, that if I'm within 95% of that maximum, that's good enough. So if we drop a line down here, that comes in at about that 30,000 plants per acre range. But know that there is another 5% gain that can occur with grain yield. And typically, though, the economics oftentimes don't justify that, because the economics are always going to show an optimum lower than where the maximum yield is. So the economic optimum here is around 35,000 plants per acre, and we cross that 95% economic optimum level at about 26,000 plants per acre. So farmers that are planting 30 to 32,000 plants per acre are really in that kind of that optimum, if you will, for the economic optimum of what we typically see. So that's
Joe,
the grain.
we've got a question in the chat. Sorry to interrupt. Is N application rate changing with higher populations, or do we just shoot for the normal application rate?
Yeah, we don't see. I did a lot of work with Larry Bundy years ago with nitrogen rates and that sort of thing, and we don't see a big change in fertility recommendations as you change plant population. In other words, we saw no response. The optimum nitrogen rate was the same for populations at 30 versus 40,000 plants per acre. And this was done years ago, and we may need to update that a little bit, but we really didn't see any response or interaction that goes on with plant population and nitrogen rate.
Thanks.
So that's the grain side. Here's the forage side, or the silage side. And what we see with forage is we see an optimum population of around 48,000 plants per acre. When we look at milk per ton, that's always at the lowest population that we study, because we tend to get bigger ears relative to the amount of stover that's out there. And when you look at the economic optimum, or milk per acre, it's typically less than forage yield, but it's around 45,000 plants per acre. But again, that economic optimum, this red line here, we cross that 95% level at about 31 to 32,000 plants per acre. So these responses are very broad-shouldered, but this is kind of what we see. But what I want to leave you with is just the importance of testing this decision, because I think probably for every field and every hybrid on a field, that optimum population is going to be a little bit higher than what you typically might expect. And I encourage you to use reference strips. Use these not only for plant population, but maybe use another reference strip for nitrogen rates, for example. But what I mean by a reference strip is you plant the whole field into what you think is or what you typically have put the population at. So if you're at 30,000 plants per acre on your farm, plant that most of the field to that population, but on one round or one pass, plant about 10% more and plant at 33,000 plants per acre. When you go back and do a yield map on grain yield, or even on silage, if you can do that, you should be able to pick this strip up. And if you don't see a difference as you harvest this field, well, then you're probably at the optimum population at 30,000 plants per acre. But if you do pick something up, well, you may want to adjust that then next year. But know that this management decision has been changing, and it's been changing over the last 30, 40 years, and it's been going up. And again, just something in a way to kind of test this relatively easily on your field. And you can do these reference strips for, fungicide application but always having one of these in your field is important for helping you make better decisions down the road. Finally, I just want to leave you with this, and I'll move through this kind of quickly because many people have seen this. One of the things about corn silage in terms of forages is that we typically see a double peak for corn silage quality, milk per ton. We'll see a peak right around flowering, just like we do with a lot of the other forages. But because we have grain coming on, we typically will see that second peak, and this is typically when we harvest, and this is when starch content is maximized. And that's really where maximum yield and quality is occurring. When we look at the quality of the stover, generally our best quality is right around silking, right around that flowering time, and then it goes down in pretty much a linear fashion as we go through the season, and it'll get to be about 80% of what the maximum was back here. But it's a relatively slow, steady decline as the season goes on. Grain yield, of course, is sigmoidal, and you have a lag period followed by a linear increase, and then another lag or a leveling off period in here. Typically, this linear period is about 40 days long. And so if you're growing 200 bushel corn, typically during this time, over this 40-day period, you're putting on about 5 bushels per acre per day. And of course, we want to harvest this for corn for silage at that just prior to the black layer stage. Milk per acre kind of goes like this as you go through the season. Forage moisture is kind of it reduces in kind of a two-phase pattern, kind of slow at first, but then as that grain matures, it matures, it dries faster and faster. And it's largely because what's happening is the grain is starting to dry down. And so one way to kind of optimize for a bunker silo is to basically raise and lower the cutter bar. And by raising the bar, basically what you're doing is drying out that forage that you're harvesting. If you want it wetter, you would lower the bar down to normal 6 inches above the soil surface. But because of this, we've got a whole bunch of different decisions that need to be made. If it's poor pollen, it all depends on pollination. If it's poor, harvest anytime. Fair leaf or silage harvest. If it's good, you got all the options available to you. But typically we'll be harvesting, we can harvest silage at these different stages here. And then you got earlage, toplage, snaplage, high moisture corn, that sort of thing, usually shortly after that, about a couple of weeks. And then of course, grain harvest is out in this part of the time scale. So with that, I'll stop and see if there are any questions. Again, you can kind of follow us during the season and subscribe to, I do a number of blog articles during the season that might help with some of the decisions that are out there. So with that, I'll stop, Kevin, and turn it back to you.
Thanks, Joe. We've got a little bit of time for a few questions. Those of you, if you have something that you haven't posted in the chat, please do so, and we'll get to it. Joe, early on, you talked about the range and relative impact percent as far as those items. You had hybrid selection, which 40% difference as far as yield. You had hybrid maturity, hybrid type, plant density, planting date, row spacing, rotation. Which one of those is the biggest blind spot for farmers that's keeping them from getting the higher silage yields that they want? We know that the hybrid maturity accounts for 40%, but forget the impact. Which is the one in the terms of frequency that you see as the biggest miss?
Well, hybrid selection is is one of the biggest, but the other one that really sneaks up on people is planting date. You know, typically what goes into the bunker oftentimes is the worst looking field. It's always the bad looking field that is challenged for grain yield. But you know, we see our optimum planting dates actually as early or even earlier than grain oftentimes. And so that one is one that is kind of a blindside. And again, it's because it's always the worst looking field that will oftentimes end up in the bunker. But a bigger impact is that whole harvest timing. I think there's two major challenges: is hybrid selection, and then the other one is harvest timing at the end of the season, because you'll have a lot of yield coming on yet as that kernel is still filling, but you're trading that off with leaf loss due to the lower leaves just senescing naturally and that sort of thing, and just the whole trying to get a handle on what the timing is going to be of when to get out there and really harvest it at the correct moisture. At some point, yield is just a moot point. And really what you're managing towards the end there is getting the moisture for the storage structure. And again, that can sneak up on you. And if it's wrong, you can have up to about a 15% shrink, easily 15% shrink or more in that bunker. So getting that right is probably our second biggest challenge, but the one that sneaks up on you is that planting date, I feel.
Sure. I can attest that in 23 years working here in Outagamie and having a forage council that does dry downs every year, this was the hardest year as far as us having samples brought in, and they were, instead of a point or two off, remember you're selecting a few stalks from an entire field, farmers would go back, start chopping, and they had juicing at the band of the chopper, much less the structure. And so there were challenges.
The other decision that kind of sneaks up on you a little bit that you wouldn't expect is the economic thresholds for pests. They're higher for corn silage than they are for grain. And it's because you can capture the value of that corn through milk. And that is a product that's a lot more valuable oftentimes than what you can do for grain, selling it in the market. So the economic thresholds that we've measured in the past oftentimes are much lower. In other words, you got to treat quicker with corn silage than you do for grain oftentimes. And so I'll just throw that out as another thing that we've observed through the years.
Sure. We've got about 2 minutes left, and we've got a question that did come into the chat. High flex hybrids and dropping the plant population. Yeah. Does it increase digestibility?
Well, what it does is it increases starch content. And as far as, there's two kinds of digestibility, the stover and the grain. You got to keep those kind of separate. I question flex hybrids because on an ear, you'll have up to 1,000 ovules that will form on the ear, but only about 400 to 600 of those ovules actually fertilize and produce grain. And that is driven so much, it's driven by the genetics, which gives us this flex fix kind of an idea that's out there, but it's driven by environment much more so than it is by, oftentimes there's tendencies, in the genetics, but it's driven by the environment. And we have more than enough ovules that are oftentimes produced, and it becomes an issue of pollination during that pollination period, getting adequate fertilization of those ovules so that they survive and grow. And otherwise you'll have a lot of kernel abortion that can occur and lower that. But one of the things that happens when you have a lower population is you'll have oftentimes a bigger ear, which increases starch content, and overall your milk per ton goes up because you got a better harvest index, if you will, of grain to stover. And so oftentimes there's recommendations done that way. But remember that these are the data I showed here today, these are kind of random hybrids. We didn't select them on fix or flex characteristics. We probably could do that or should do that. But you can see how as you go to lower populations, there's always these trade-offs that occur between yield, milk per ton, and then the overall milk per acre. And so you got to kind of balance all that with the seed cost as well too. So I'm not promoting seed price or seed cost here, but that has been our typical response that we've seen through the years. That was a 10-year data set that I showed you there. And of course, we've got about now 30 years of data on plant population where we've seen this optimum going up over time. But the principle is that your maximum yield is different than your economic optimum, and it's typically lower than where you see that maximum yield. Knowing where that maximum yield is for a field is an important thing to do, and that's where these reference strips come in handy.
Sure, sounds good. And what I would say is if there are additional questions for Joe, we may have some time at the end. Joe, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing so we can allow Damon Smith, our next presenter, to get his screen up. And while he's doing that, Dr. Damon Smith with the University of Wisconsin Madison is a field crops pathologist, and he's going to be presenting research-based solutions for managing diseases of silage corn. Damon.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. I just want to start off and acknowledge some students and postdocs and technicians who contributed to a lot of the work I'll present here. I'm the pretty face that gets to talk about this stuff, but they're the ones that actually do the work. I'll especially be talking quite a bit about some stuff that Maxwell Chibwagu, PhD student's been doing in my program. Before I get started, I just want to let folks know that the Wisconsin Fungicide Tests and Disease Management Summary is now online. So if you subscribe to my blog and that sort of thing, you probably already found your way to that link. But for those of you who may not have seen it, it is out there. I think that link will get dropped in the chat for you as well. My first words of wisdom, I guess, as we had this discussion is that we're sort of hyper focused on tar spot lately. We've had 5 years or so a consistent tar spot presence. It is impactful in silage, but don't get tar spot tunnel vision. You need to balance this, and in my opinion, in our geography, we got to balance it with the gibberella or fusarium diseases. So as I talk about this, there's going to be a little bit of a focus on tar spot, but the discussion is going to include balancing with gibberella and DON accumulation. So let's just talk about what happened through the seasons, and specifically in 2022. This is obviously a reoccurring problem. Unless you've been asleep for the last 5 years or so, you probably realize that it's been a significant issue here in Wisconsin. The darker the red here just shows you the counties where we've had more years of occurrence, and we have quite a few counties in Wisconsin where we have quite a bit of experience with tar spot over the years. Here's the 2022 county wide map for basically where tar spot's found in the U.S. Obviously, the gray is where we've had it in the past, and the gold indicates where we continue to or saw it in 2022. Let's just talk a little about what drives this. I know you've seen this before, but I really, really want you to understand that this is very different than some of the other diseases you deal with. And the reason for that is it is a repeating cycle disease similar to northern corn leaf blight and gray leaf spot. The problem with it is that it has what we call a very long incubation period in the field. And what that means is the time from initial infection to when we actually see symptom development or the development of the tar spots can be as long as, say, 30 days in the field. And so there's a perception that this is a sneaky thing, which it is, and that, it comes in real fast and hard. But remember, those infections that you're seeing, or at least the development of those symptoms, those infections actually happen quite a bit of time prior to when you're actually seeing them develop. There's some recent paper just out. It's actually being reviewed right now that suggests that in the lab, under perfect conditions, that incubation period's around 14 days. So rather quick, but what we actually see in the field, based on our epidemiological data, is it can vary from anywhere from 21 days to 40 days. So there's about an average of about 30 or so days in there. So keep that in mind, because once we get into that repeating cycle, especially if the weather is conducive, we have these wetting conditions and long periods of leaf wetness. That's what really pushes us very rapidly, because each of those tar spots is then essentially ejecting spores up into the canopy, and it'll move from bottom up. We typically see a bottom up movement now here in Wisconsin. It can overwinter in the residue. We've done work here in Wisconsin, other states to show that. There is some mortality over the winter months, but it is not a 100% mortality. So we do have initial inoculum in the fields. So we typically see a bottom up movement, as you might expect. Once it gets up towards the top of the canopy, that's where we start to get dry down, or quick dry down. And that's where we really see some impact in silage. Now, the conditions that push this, you've all seen this probably before. Just want to reiterate, it's all about moisture. Temperature is important. These are ideal conditions. We do know that high temps are not lethal. So you can't get complacent if we have hot weather, a drought, that sort of thing. That is not lethal to the pathogen. Does it slow it down? It sure does. But we learned in 2021, the minute the temperature becomes conducive and it starts raining again, the pathogen will pick up and take off where it left off. Okay, so keep that in mind. What I would say, the rule of thumb, when you have days where you're walking corn and you still have wet pants at noon, those conditions have given you long periods of leaf wetness, and that's going to be really conducive for this pathogen. And so the risk is there, and the risk is there especially during the tassel time. Let's just switch gears a little bit here, talk a little about Gib. So remember, Gibberella, or the Fusarium species in general, can actually infect the corn plant multiple ways. And we actually think about this quite a bit in my lab. We look at the ear rot cycle, and we kind of keep that independent from what we call the stalk rot cycle. Either way, the pathogen is coming from residue, local sources of inoculum. This fungus overwinters just fine. It overwinters on both corn residue and wheat residue. We talked about that rotation and how that can bridge the gap here. Usually the ear rot infections are happening during the silk timing. That's why usually when we're trying to balance this, we're talking about that R1 white silk fungicide application to basically protect those silks from infection. And then with the stalk rot cycle, it's a little more complicated. We're learning more about this. We can have infections through the root, through the crown, even through the leaf nodes or the leaf whorls. You got a nice moisture compartment down in here, spore falls in there, can infect the stalk. So we're working on trying to understand the actual epidemiology and tracking that. That's a lot of what Maxwell's been doing, but understand that we can have accumulation of vomitoxin both in the ear portion of the plant and the stalk portion. And depending on the weather and the year and the hybrid, we could even have both portions infected at different times, giving rise to vomitoxin. So that's something that's unique when it comes to considering silage versus grain, where we're typically mostly concerned with the ear rot side of things. So again, just to kind of reiterate what I said in the last slide, we're really concerned not only from the infection standpoint and the reduced quality, but also the accumulation of deoxynivalenol, DON, or vomitoxin. And that accumulation can again occur either in the stalk portions of the plant and or the ear portion of the plant, in some years occurring together. So let's go back to tar spot here now that we kind of have the lay of the land of the diseases. You've probably seen this before. This is some data we put together from the 2018 epidemic, just looking at grain yield loss. Obviously, we have some grain yield loss, whether we have short relative maturities or long. We know the grain loss, yield loss is higher in the longer RMs. That makes sense. We have a pathogen that loves green material. So the longer something is green, the more opportunity we have for the fungus and the greater the yield reductions are. So if we actually solve the slope of these lines that you see here, that'll tell us what the yield loss is. And in the short relative maturities in the left-hand side, we see it's about 5 bushels for every 10% increase in tar spot severity. And for, excuse me, the long RMs, it's around 8.2 bushels for every 10% on the ear leaves. So pretty substantial in terms of grain, but what's that look like with silage? I spent about a day and a half actually mining some of our silage data from Arlington. We have controlled studies there every year where we look at this. We've had tar spot in those trials now for 5 years, since 2018. I combined the data and then roughed out what the yield reduction would be in terms of dry matter yield based on that location. Obviously, there's lots of noise here that's hybrid related, environment related, et cetera, but you can see we can fit a line and we can calculate some yield reduction in terms of dry matter yield there. So it is impactful. I also looked at things like moisture. I couldn't tease the moisture thing out as clearly as I could the dry matter yield, but we know anecdotally that, you know, we're chopping drier than ideal silage, is really, really hard to back that in the bunker. So it is something we need to watch out for when tar spot moves in. Now, in terms of what that dry matter reduction is, I calculated that based on the estimates in that previous slide. So here, if we use around a 10.9 ton per acre dry matter yield across those trials, so that's just what the average was. At 10%, we're experiencing about a 15% reduction in dry matter yield. At 20%, a 27% reduction. And then at 30%, that's a typo. That should actually be, I think it's around 35% reduction. You can see the actual tonnage there. It's 1.6 at 10%, 3 tons at 20%, 4.2 tons. So any way you slice it, you can take those percentages, kind of fix that to your yield potential. You'll get an idea, especially in a heavy tar spot year like 2018 or 2021. It is a significant impact on that silage plant.
Damon, before you go further, I hate to interrupt, but we've got a question.
Okay.
Does manure application have any effect on tar spot presence or severity?
We don't think so. We don't know if it can survive the track of the animal, the intestinal tract of the animal. We suspect it probably can't readily, just given the type of organism it is. It's a little different than some of the other organisms that can survive the track of the animal. So as far as the actual movement of inoculum, probably not a risk there. If you're curious about high nitrogen, if you're heavy manured fields, your nitrogen might be really high in a particular field. We have not been able to tease out a nitrogen effect either. So those are some things that we've looked at in conjunction with Marty Chilvers over at Michigan State. We can't find a relationship there. Agronomically, we can find a relationship in seeding rates. So and it's actually counterintuitive. And both Marty and I have seen this both in silage and grain. It turns out that actually at lower seeding rates, we have higher tar spot severity. And we're not exactly sure why biologically, but we do know when we go into a field to look for tar spot, we never go to the middle of the field. We actually go to the edges of the field first. So there's something about light that probably drives this, and air movement and those sorts of things.
Interesting. The more we know, the more questions we have, right?
Right. Yeah, this is a complicated animal.
Thank you.
We've also looked at residue. Some of you have probably seen this slide. I need to update this with new site years that we have from 2022 now, but the relationship's the same. We do know that residue management can give us an incremental reduction. So if you're corn on corn, no-till, I wouldn't abandon conservation tillage just to manage your residue, though, because that incremental drop is fairly small, and the inoculum can move a pretty good distance. So even if you took care of a local inoculum in that field, you're still going to have inoculum moving around the state. Where we do see the biggest benefits in terms of reduction come from the resistance. So if you look at a hybrid that's rated more resistant than another hybrid, that drop can be worth as much as 50% across our trials. So that's where I suggest folks spend the majority of their time is looking at those hybrids, trying to understand what works best on their farm and gives them some level of resistance there. All right, let's move into fungicides. We get a lot of questions there. You've probably seen this slide deck. I'm going to talk just a little about what we've known from past years. I'll show you some 2022 data, specifically from silage. This is grain, so you can see all the major products there, the 2 and 3-way modes of action. What was really interesting from this study is we wanted to ask simply the question, how fancy do we need to be with our choice? You know, do we need 1 mode of action in the jug, 2 modes of action, or 3 modes of action? So we collapsed the data set down and analyzed it that way. And very interestingly, you know, anywhere you use a fungicide, you can detect a nice reduction relative to the non-treated, especially in again, those years where it's really conducive for tar spot specifically. But what's really doing the work is the 2 and 3-way modes of action. You can see, especially from a yield standpoint, we can detect across 8 different environments statistically significant increase in yield. This is grain yield over the non-treated. So that's really where you need to be looking. So, you know, cost comes into it. If you can still buy a good old headline amp relatively inexpensively, that's still a really good product against tar spot. I like it if we're going to think about balancing that with Jib. That's also a good product there, as well as other 2 and 3-way mode of action products. So you don't need to be real fancy. You just need to have at least 2 modes of action in the jug. If you're just really concerned about specific product, here's some data from 2021. Again, this is grain corn, 5 environments here, very, very high tar spot levels in this particular fields, or this particular set of data. So 25% tar spot severity on ear leaves. And you can see the things doing most of the work in terms of reduction: Delaro Complete, Veltima, and Revitec. Headline amp right in the mix, Approach Prima. You'll see some of the single mode of action things starting to get a little inconsistent for us, but everything did give us a reduction relative to the non-treated. So pretty consistent with what we saw in our previous data sets. Of course, we do have some things that do carry the load maybe a little better than some others. But again, if you choose a good 2 or 3-way mode of action product, you're in the mix. And obviously, where we reduce tar spot severity, especially in a significant year like 2021, we tend to get a yield response, which you would expect there. And you can see the better things kind of floating up to the top there, with a 20 to 25 bushel advantage over the non-treated control. So let's look at, you know, silage hybrids and fungicides, and then look at fungicides specifically. I did mine that data set just looking at the response. Surprisingly, I was expecting the BMRs to be a little more responsive in terms of, you know, ear leaf severity from tar spot, but it turns out the non-BMR conventional or you know, multi-purpose hybrids, however you want to classify them, those are actually a little more susceptible, it seems, and a little more responsive to fungicide there. Both groups or classes of hybrids is pretty responsive, but the non-BMRs, at least in my trials over the last 5 years or so, being a little more responsive. Now, with that said, the BMRs tend to be more susceptible to Jib. So that is something you have to watch out for. We see that, and you'll see that here in some data in a second. So keep that in mind as you're kind of thinking about balancing this a little bit, and what you can manage and what types of fungicides you could get on, and the timing and those sorts of things.
Damon, I need to interrupt you again. We've got a question. You mentioned the typical R1 growth stage is a good time to target fungicides to reduce ear molts. With tar spot severity increasing significantly later in the season, would you recommend we move a fungicide timing if the target is tar spot? Should we be waiting until R3, R4 to apply fungicide if doing a 1 pass?
Nope. No, you'll see this. So this is a good segue into this data. I still like the R1 white silk timing if we're going to think about balancing the major issues that we see here in our geography. So, you know, if you have a hybrid that you know is going to be susceptible to Jib, you've had a history of Gibberella, you're fighting mycotoxins in a particular field, do not move the fungicide timing to, you know, be specific for tar spot. So yes, it can move in late, but we still see well-timed VT R1 applications, a single application really carrying the load. We have lots of timing data now, even looking at those late R3 applications. Yes, we can get some reduction in tar spot, although we still see stronger reductions with the VT R1s. So I don't want to see us give up control for one disease while trying to gain some control on another, where we can actually balance and optimize that between the two by maintaining that R1 window. And actually the window is actually the start of silk to about 5 to 7 days after the start of silk.
There you go, folks. No ambiguity in that answer.
So yeah, like I said, that's a nice segue into this slide set. So here this is again just one data point. This has been pretty consistent with what we've seen over the years, and this is in the fungicide book along with some other trials in there. So at your leisure, you can take a look at some of that other data, but you'll see tar spot severity here was in the blue bars. We got some ear rot severity bouncing around. That's not unusual. I'll show you the DON data here in a second, and that's really what we're more interested in, is actually reducing overall DON content. But where we put a fungicide on, we get a drop in tar spot, right? So we can control this. We can control it across a wide window. So DON is going to be a bigger cost to your farm in the long run, in my opinion. So we need to look at that and make sure, in terms of timing, we're coming in at that R1 timing. And you'll see this here in a slide or two. That's really where it's going to balance the two diseases. We're still getting control of tar spot. And so don't give that up. Don't push to R3 just to try to, reduce the tar spot severity. Things that work pretty well, again, Delaro Complete, Revitec, Veltima, those things tend to be right in the mix. There's some Miravis Neo treatments in here as well, carrying the load. In terms of canopy greening, where we reduce tar spot, we do get a increasing overall canopy greening, especially near or at harvest time. So right around that R5.5 or so, when we're going to chop, we can see a nice, canopy greening relationship there in the blue bar. Yield can sometimes bounce around for us. That's why we look at multiple site years, because that can be a harder thing to sort of tease out in these smaller plot trials. So you see those orange bars are kind of moving around a little bit. And then in terms of silage quality, the same sorts of things. Here's the milk per ton, TTNDFD. So we're not really giving up much across the different timings. So again, just optimizing, thinking about vomitoxin reduction first. So targeting that R1, and then thinking about product choice in terms of those 2- and 3-way modes of action, I think is a good way to sort of balance the diseases without giving up a lot in terms of yield and overall quality here. In terms of DON data, here's the DON total chopped silage DON data from the plots. We can see some things breaking out, sort of what I would call my A group in the red box, and then the B group in the middle, and then the C group. Things inside the yellow box not different from the non-treated control. So Revitec hit R1. This Miravis Neo at V14 is a little bit of a head scratcher. It tends to bounce around a little bit for us from one year to the next, but is in the mix. And then, of course, our R1 Miravis Neo, a nice reduction in terms of vomitoxin there relative to the non-treateds. 2-pass Miravis Neo and a V14 Trivapro in the B group there. So again, target that R1. That's been consistent across our data sets. If you look back in my fungicide trials, you'll see 10 years worth of data now, when it comes to vomitoxin and a lot of those reports. And so you'll see pretty consistently over time that is the timing that really maximizes control. So in the last couple of minutes here, I just want to talk about where we're headed with some of the work, trying to look at what we're doing in the field, and then how is that actually impacting silage as it's being going through the storage process and being ensiled in that bunker. And we've been doing this now over a few years using these mini silos. We're using polyethylene bags here. I realize that this is not like a giant bunker silo, but we're trying to ask the question, if we're applying at that R1 timing with, say, Proline or Headline Amp, how does that compare to a non-treated through an ensiling time of 120 days? So we're doing a time course here. We're using BMRs and a non-BMR, and we're carrying this through from 0, 30, 60, 90, and 120 days. So we're going in after those time periods and actually looking at what the DON content is in that total silage that's chopped. Very interestingly, what we're seeing now, and this is pretty consistent across years, is that in the first 30 days, we continue to get a significant increase in vomitoxin in that chopped silage. And, you know, the relationship is pretty consistent even where we have fungicides. So in other words, the shape of the line remains the same. I'll show you in the next slide that using fungicide at R1 can help reduce the initial amount of DON, and then even if it increases, we still come out with less DON at the end. Once we get past 30 days or so, these lines, there is a little bit of movement in these lines, but essentially this is leveled out, right? So really a lot of the action is happening in that first 30 days. And you can see the BMRs more susceptible than the non-BMRs. I mentioned that previously, so that's something you have to watch out for. But it's really all the action is happening in that first 30 days. There's a couple hypotheses for this. One of our hypotheses was confirmed by a recent paper out of Germany, actually demonstrating that the masked form of DON, so there's a form of DON that can't be detected on most of the general tests. We call that DON 3G. That masked form of DON is actually being metabolized in the first 30 days. In other words, there's a glucoside that's actually being removed through the metabolization in the ensiling process and releasing the detectable forms of DON. We're also looking at how much, even if we suck all the oxygen out, you know, there's still some residual oxygen there. Are we still also seeing fusarium growing and pumping out mycotoxin? So we're trying to understand what's actually happening in that first 30 days. But either way you look at it, here's some 2020 data, just pulling out a single year, that relationship again significant in the first 30 days. And then the total DON, if you look at it over time, you can see we get a reduction where we use Proline at R1 and again, Headline Amp at R1. So this is really why I want folks, if you're going to make good silage and trying to balance the diseases, I want to see it at R1, that white silk. You got about 5 to 7 days after white silk is kind of your window. And then after that 7-day period, you know, your success in terms of reducing DON levels is going to start to go away. You will still be able to control tar spot, but you can't expect as good a control when it comes to DON. So I'll finish up here with this slide. This is my tar spot take home for silage while still balancing gibberella and DON. So some takeaways there. You can take a screenshot of this. It'll be in the recording. Again, hybrid, you know, in terms of preseason, hybrid, I think is the best thing to really focus on. Understand that, you know, tar spot can overwinter here, as can gib. So you're going to be having those issues year in and year out. We're going to have tar spot somewhere in the state this year. It's going to occur. It's been occurring every year since we first seen it. So you just have to pay attention to the weather, especially that leaf wetness. And then if you're going to think about in-season management, it's really that R1 timing and then your 2- and 3-way modes of action. That's where you want to put your investments. So with that, I'm going to throw up my contact information there, and I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has anything.
So the good news is we have plenty of time. We still have about 10 minutes here. So if there are questions that you have for Damon, please get those in the chat. I know that up here in Outagamie County, we avoided tar spot until relatively late before it showed up. So we had a lot of stuff that didn't end up needing to be dealt with as far as yield loss. Here we go. Is there any evidence that tar spot and silage negatively impacts cow health?
None that anybody can find. There was a lot of interest in that, especially after the 2018 epidemic. And a lot of us spent a lot of time looking for mycotoxins that might impact cow health, and nobody can find anything. And we haven't seen any data from other states or anything like that to suggest that there's a direct impact. So as far as tar spot itself, we don't believe that there's any issues there. Now, in terms of palatability, quality of silage, you know, we've seen some really, really poor silage made. So, I mean, there are those issues where, you know, if it's just, if you know you're just chopping really bad corn, you might reconsider what you're going to do with that particular product. But as far as actual impacts on the cow, there's nothing to really be concerned about there that we know of. I am concerned about Don. So, I mean, obviously, if these two things are occurring together and, the plant's getting double whammied, you got to watch that Don content and test and be sure you know what's going into that bunker.
All right, we've got another one. Have you seen any response from planter applied fungicide, capital IE X? Yeah.
Xyway.
Xyway, thank you.
Yeah, we do in-furrow trials every year. I've got a pretty long data set on Xyway now over the years, and we have looked at it in silage because where I kind of see some utilities, especially in the fusarium side of things with Xyway and some of the other in-furrow strategies, especially that stalk rot infection, right? So in some years we're going to get infection by the fungus early in the season. And if we could reduce that stalk rot infection, could we drive the overall DON levels down in the finished silage? And we do see some relationship there. Where I really see the utility is, again, where we had the crown rot phase or the root rot phase, or maybe those early to mid-season infections that happen through the stalk. We do tend to see a little better standability where we use Xyway. So there is some utility there. From a tar spot standpoint, you do need to be careful. Xyway doesn't seem to have much efficacy at all on tar spots. So if you're using Xyway, especially in the silage side of things, that's fine, especially if you have an history of stalk rot or crown rot issues. I think that's okay. But remember, you can't hang your hat on tar spot control with that Xyway application. You'd have to come back with a foliar application if there's risk for tar spot there.
Sure. So I'm going to put the same question to you that I did to Joe. After the discussion that you put forth, your summary points, what is the biggest blind spot you think that farmers have when it comes to managing these diseases? I thought it was a great question, checking about R3, R4 versus R1. That's why I said, wow, hey, there's no ambiguity in that answer. We know for sure that's how they want to do it. So go to the opposite end of the spectrum of that answer. What's the thing that people are missing and you shake your head and say, ah?
Yeah, it's the early to mid-season stalk infections. We struggle with this in our program, and where I still don't have a great answer in terms of how do we anticipate or know what's kind of going on inside the plant with those types of infections. With the ear rot phase, you can walk out there a lot of times, you can pull ears back and see what kind of rot you have and that sort of thing, and maybe make some decisions or take some grain and test. But when it comes to the stalk rot phase of things, you just don't know what's happening. I think what to look for, and I've been actually looking at the last 5 years, I've been looking at the precipitation departures from the 30-year normals, and we're trending more towards wet and sporadically wet periods, and then we'll have intermittent dry spells in between. And so where we see really bad stalk rot and where you could anticipate that is usually after we've planted, and if we get a really big rain event and we're wet for a while. I think we had one of those, it was like maybe 2019 or 2020, I can't remember in there, but we had one of those years where we all were able to plant. Then it got super wet and the seed kind of sat there, and I think we had some infections and stuff was just slow getting moving because we didn't have heat units. Those types of years, I think we're gonna have bigger risks for crown and stalk issues, and that's really the unforeseen. And silage, it's taken some yield out of us, it takes some quality out of it, and those sorts of things. So that's really, from a pathology standpoint, I think where the real blind spot is right now.
Perfect. I'm not seeing any further questions in the chat, so I'm going to say thank you, Damon, for the time and effort with the presentation. I think it's important for the public to know that Maxwell was up here in Outagamie County collecting samples with other graduate students from Damon's lab. So the whole point of extension, the Wisconsin idea, is that the boundaries of the campus are the boundaries of the state. And this is an excellent example, the information that Damon shared today, where they are getting out into the far recesses of Wisconsin and pulling this data from places where those of you tuned in today can understand that the geography that's covered allows us to provide representative information to the whole state. Is that fair to say, Damon?
Yeah, we really appreciate it. I'm sure there's some farmers on here who we sampled in, and that I didn't talk about that data today. What we're learning is actually our assumptions about species within the fusarium complex are incorrect. And so stay tuned to that story, the sampling, and we'll be reaching out probably to folks on this call and others to do some more sampling in 2023. So that's going to be really important as we move forward. We're learning a lot about who we're battling, so to speak. And once we know who our enemy is, then we can hopefully fashion our management strategy. So that's been really, really impactful for Maxwell's work. And we sure appreciate the ability to get in folks' fields.
Real quickly, while we were talking, another question came in. Is there a difference with conventional versus no-till systems and the presence of these or cover crop termination methods?
Well, I mean, when it comes to tar spot and tight rotations, of course, where we have a lot of high residue and that sort of thing, the fusarium thing's a little more complicated. Tight rotations with wheat can keep that inoculum, we call it inoculum density in the field. It can keep it pretty high. But the fusarium is a there's many species as we're learning, and there are species that'll infect lots of different crops. So it's pretty ubiquitous. When you go into a field and we sample, we can always find some fusarium somewhere, right? And so in terms of like trying to go after one or the other, I don't know if there's a lot of utility in really changing up what you're doing. The cover crop thing is interesting. We're starting to take a little better look at that. We've been doing some work in soybeans specifically on the cover crop side of things, just because it's a little easier system to work in than cover crops with corn. But there is some risk sometimes of shifting to other pathogen issues, so we do need to be a little bit careful with that. And I am concerned a little bit about pythiums and seed rot pathogens when we have cover crops in the mix there. So that is something to be concerned with. Hopefully, if we're planting a little later, there's a little more heat there and we can beat some of those pathogens which cause problems. But we can see a little bit of trade-off.
All right. Once again, thank you to Damon Smith and to Joe Lauer for their presentations today. While I'm talking, if you have questions that you'd like them to answer, please continue to put those in the chat. I would ask that my colleagues and peers watch the clock for me. Since I'm the next presenter, I don't really need somebody else to introduce me. As I mentioned, my name is Kevin Jarek. I'm the crops and soils educator up here in Northeast Wisconsin, covering a regional area of Outagamie and Winnebago. And what I want to do is take a few minutes today to talk about corn silage budget projections. And I thought this was the best slide to start with because it represents what I mentioned earlier. This truly was the worst year we've had in my time here trying to get the silage moistures as accurate as we could for people to ensile, whether it was a combination of field conditions, weather, or what have you. We definitely had issues, but it also serves the purpose of illustrating that no matter what I tried to do today, the numbers that I share with you are going to be wrong. It's kind of like this field here. You can walk 20 feet to the left or 20 feet to the right, and you're going to have two very different things. The goal is not to share numbers with you that are exact, to show you a concept, provide you links to resources, and then hopefully we'll be able to go from there. So the same problem that Joe had as far as advancing for a minute, I wonder if my slide went to sleep here. I'm going to try this and it is not moving. So let me stop share here real quick. We'll go back. Are you able to see my screen?
Not yet, Kevin.
Okay.
There, it's coming now. There you go.
All right, let's go slideshow. Come on. Here we go. Now, there.
It looks good.
And that's what happens when you wait 10 minutes with a computer that has its memory full. So real quickly, when we talk about a budget, whether you have owned land or rented land, here you can see on the left-hand side, cash rent has increased in the last 10-year period about $25. We're at about 125 up to 150. It's important to note that these are averages reported. This isn't necessarily the market price. We have people who are related to one another. An uncle may rent to a cousin or whatever, and so they're renting that land for far under what they could get if they advertised it or put it to the open market for bidding. On the right-hand side, you can see on the far right-hand end of that bar graph, you can see cropland value statewide average. It just keeps trending upward, and we're at about $6,000 an acre. So some people like graphs, others like charts. Here, if you simply follow across the top cash rent, you can see 2018 statewide average, we are at 140, 2019, 142, 2020, 146. We dropped in 2021, but that was mainly because of all the stuff that happened in 2020. You can see we rebounded very quickly in 2022. I'm a visual learner, so if you can show me something, that's what I'll choose. Here's a nice map of Wisconsin. So if you want to see what your average county rate is compared to your neighbors, again, you can visit the website link that you see there. These are, you can either take a screenshot, take a photo on your phone, or I know Jerry is going to be dropping some things in the chat as it relates to links in my presentation. I'm just going to pick out my county that I've worked in for 23 years, and that is Outagamie County. I cover Winnebago as well, but we'll remember that 158 number. We'll come back to that. So if I'm going to build a budget, I also need to figure out what my machinery costs are. So as far as equipment is concerned, we do have the Wisconsin 2021 custom rate guide. Because of the fact that those numbers reflect values that were surveyed in 2020 and now it's 2023, what I do is I will go to Iowa for information. And the only reason I do this is because they do survey their folks and update it every year. So as we get further out with this Wisconsin custom rate guide, I'll go to the higher end of the range as opposed to the middle or lower, and I'll compare a number with the most recent Iowa one if possible. So then we get to how are we going to value our silage? Shout out to our colleague, Ryan Sterry, who's a regional dairy educator over in Northwest Wisconsin. There's a link at the bottom there where you can easily go download a spreadsheet that allows you to put in values that will help estimate a value for your corn to put in this crop enterprise budget. Now, we can talk all day long about the nitrogen rates that we're going to put in. Here's what I'm going to say. If you have not downloaded the apps from the NPM website, here's your chance. We've got the corn rate calculator, the N price calculator, and the crop calculators, all easily downloadable, very useful tools. However, when we look at recommendations that we are getting off of an app, such as the corn N rate calculator, we need to remember that if we're dealing with a nutrient management plan, if we have credits that we need to take and subtract those, we also have to account for the nitrogen in the starter fertilizer. So the numbers that are going to be presented today aren't going to be what yours are, but first and foremost, you need to pay attention to whatever the regulatory aspects are that apply to your operation. So as far as today is concerned, we are going to work off of a spreadsheet. This was put together by a number of peers in Extension. I believe Jerry Clark, Bill Halfman, Carl Dooley, myself, Carrie Lebowski all contributed to this effort. And again, you can see the link there. You can go to the Crops and Soils Topic Hub page for the Division of Extension, and you can see there are all different types of headings there that you can select from for this information. Yield. I know that everybody harvests 30 wet tons of corn silage, 10 tons of dry matter, but the National Ag Statistics Service would say otherwise. They say that the state average in 2020 was 21 tons per acre. In 2021, it was 21.5. And so I'm going to extrapolate and say that, well, we have a trend of moving a half ton per acre, so we'll use 22 tons wet for our values here. Again, you can see where those numbers are pulled from. Here is the spreadsheet that I mentioned from Ryan Sterry. I put in a grain yield of 169. And the only reason I did that is because I'm dealing with a case right now between two farmers from last year, and that happened to be the yield. And we're having to do some reverse engineering as it relates to silage yields. As far as the value that I put in for the market price, it's very rare it would be the same for the seller and the buyer, because if there's drying that needs to occur for that dry corn to be marketed versus being chopped as silage, you lose that expense. That number of 539 is for the November 2023 contract for 2023. Now, if you go to the July 2023 contract or any of the months prior to that, we're almost nearly $1 higher. So again, numbers are going to range for everyone depending on their circumstance. I decided I could not avoid this and needed to put it in. As Joe Lauer said, and I 100% agree with Joe, there is no way any of us can predict for sure what's going to happen with the weather. However, I will say this, in almost a quarter century working for Extension, I can't remember a time when you looked west of the Mississippi and every single state was either abnormally dry or had moderate or greater drought present in it. You see a huge improvement out in California, unfortunately because of dousing rains, but you can see severity increasing through the mid part of the country. Bottom line is, when it comes to forage, we're in great shape here, but in other parts of the country that have been suffering drought, they've got some issues that are going to stay with them. So let's get to it. 22 tons of silage, 65% moisture. I'm using a value of $55 per ton. And we have a total value of $1,210 on that field. As far as a liquid starter, we use 5 gallons, estimated cost of $700 a ton, $700 for that product. And so we can see that we have a little over $20 there. If you use dry starter, again, those prices of $700, those are estimated. What isn't estimated is my nitrogen cost. I did get a quote here from Northeast Wisconsin, $700 a ton for urea, which works out to 76 cents per unit of N. Again, I already mentioned your range for nitrogen application is going to vary on MRTN. Yes, for silage, if you're trying to maximize yield, you might use a ratio of 0.05 for those familiar with MRTN. But the ratio with $700 urea is actually closer to 0.12. And again, at the end of the day, this might be out of some of your hands as a result of SNAP Plus nutrient management plans and other things. As far as phosphorus is concerned, we have a lot of fields that need little or none. We accounted for that in the starter fertilizer. And I assumed if we have a dairy farm, we have alfalfa in the rotation. So we are pulling quite a bit of potassium out of that soil. So 200 pounds of 0060, 0062, and that price 610 for potash, 0062 comes out to 49.50 cents a unit. So you can see what we did there. And I'm waiting for my computer to forward again here. I don't know why it's freezing. Come on. All right, I am going to stop share. And we're going to grab this again. And I have just a couple minutes left, so I'm sure we can still pull this off. All right. Slideshow. Oops. Come on. All right, as we move forward, we can see as far as manure, if you have that, you can work that into the system. As far as spreading cost, I checked with the CCA. They told me $850 to $950. Lime, you may or may not need lime, but if you're going to have alfalfa in the rotation, this is spread across all the crops. So we've got about $40 credited there. If you don't need that, that's fine. You can take that out. As far as our seed, I talked to CCAs again, $200 to $250 is what they're generally seeing as far as what's being spent on silage corn. As far as herbicide costs, generally $30, $35, $40, and then an application cost of $9. You can see that accounted for there. As far as irrigation, we don't have any of that in my part of the woods. Land rent, I put 185 in because that more accurately represents a market rate as opposed to the average rate, which I said already includes some lower values because of family and friends, partnership, that sort of stuff. Crop insurance, I talked to someone who sells, they said $30 is on the high end, but to go with that number. So if you get it for less, congrats. Soil testing, $2.50 a year, so you can see our costs there. When it comes to the field operations, 20 bucks for chisel plow, 17.50 for a field cultivator, 25 for planting. We've got cover crop costs covered there as well. And then when it comes to chopping, hauling, unloading, we've got 220 an acre established there. Now that's per acre. I know a lot of people will use values that are per hour, and we have the ability to put those in. I will warn you, there is a bug in this spreadsheet for the hauling or bagging, and so I have to reach out to Bill Halfman and we'll make sure that gets corrected. What I would say is just put your total value for chopping, hauling, unloading up in that top line until we get that update made. For those looking at operations per hour, here you go. You can put those numbers in, and these cells are active. They do work, so no problems there. We have to account for the material that silage is being stored in. So here we've got a bag, 260 tons, which is going to be a 9 by 200, 250 in that range. We've got the portion of the acre that is the cost for that bag. And so when we look at labor, that's taken care of in there. And so here we go. We do pay ourselves. We don't work for free. So there is a 5% management cost here. So we're taking $60 out as well, which means our total expense is $1,187.39. If you remember, $1,210 was our total. That gives us a net return of $22.61. So our cost per ton is $53.97. I valued it at $55. What's important is to look at this sensitivity analysis. So if you drop down, 2261 gets rounded up to 23. If you look in the column where it says net return per acre, the word acre, drop down three spots, you'll see the 23 there. The sensitivity analysis is nice because if we get 10% more yield, well, instead of $23, we move straight up. So if we're increasing yield, we're increasing or decreasing yield. We're either going north or south on this chart. If we're increasing or decreasing the price, we're going left or right. And so if we go straight up, $144, if we have a 10% increase in yield, what happens if we have a 10% increase in yield, but a 10% reduction in price? Well, then you would move one square to the left and you'd see $11. We're taking advantage of higher yield, but we also have a product that's worth less. And so as far as my goal here today, it wasn't to tell you anything other than we have resources available, and you certainly can download those, put your own numbers in, and we should be able to help you determine what a fair price is. So with that, we're at 1:58, and I believe if there are any questions. I see Jerry has items posted, no questions. So we're going to move on. We do have a post-webinar evaluation and would appreciate your honest feedback. I'm going to ad lib a little bit here. This really is important. It takes time for the state specialist to schedule time from their schedule to be here today, as well as the county and regional hosts to put this program together. So we really, really would appreciate if you took a few minutes to give us some honest feedback about today's program. Also, a link for a questionnaire is in the chat for CCA to scan a QR code or enter your name and certification number into the chat to receive your credits. If you have trouble opening the link, you can reach out to Scott Royce. Scott's contact information is in the chat. As you complete the poll, if there are any last questions, we'll try and take them. Otherwise, again, make sure you get your CCA credits taken care of. And we want to make sure that you are pre-registered for upcoming events. So that basically is going to take us to 2 o'clock, which is all the time we have for today. Thank you again to all of our speakers. We also want to thank you for your participation in today's webinar. We will return Wednesday, February 15th. So these are alternate Wednesdays, bi-weekly. We'll be here at 12:30, and next time we'll be optimizing alfalfa production in Wisconsin. If you haven't already done so, please again pre-register for this event. Thank you, and we hope to see you all in 2 weeks.